Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of Future States Focus. This is a podcast focusing on a deep dive look at the PBS series Future States that appeared between 2001 2014. And we try to take a look at the issues that are raised by each of these episodes. My name is Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that try to imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire. And one of our projects is this Future States Focus podcast. I'm joined by my co-host, Robyn Morris, who teaches philosophy at St. Xavier University. How are you doing, Robyn?
Good, good. How are you doing?
Things are going well. Things are going well. Today we're going to talk about, actually, is one of my favorite episodes in the series Future States, White. I've used this for a few years to try to teach questions about white supremacy and cultural appropriation in some way. And so I'm excited to sort of unpack this and try to think about like what it means to think about issues about race in the world today. I think that it has a lot of sort of, the allegory of it has a lot of things to say when we're thinking now about like, what does it mean to say that Black Lives Matter? And what is the possibility of racial equality in the country today? So have you seen this before?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that you used it in one of the classes that I took with you
Oh,
way
okay.
back when.
Yeah, I use this show sometimes, this particular episode, White, as an example of the way that speculative fiction can center race and racial issues in its work and create future environments in a way that helps us to sort of understand the impact of race and racism in our world today. And so I think that this is a particularly powerful episode. And so let's talk a little bit about this. And so it gives some folks some background about what this particular episode is about. So White is an episode from season 2. It's episode 8 of Future States, and it appeared on television on public broadcasting in May of 2011. The director is A. Saida Moreno, and she's now a professor of film and media studies at Bard College. And she's done some other kinds of works, but she hasn't done a lot of other film work. I think she's mostly been teaching in the past few years. The principles of this episode, playing the character Bato, who you see portrayed here, is Elvis Nolasco. And he went on to do a variety of different kinds of things. After White, he went on to have a role in American Crime, Claws, and then The Godfather of Harlem was his most recent appearance in 2019. Gina is portrayed by Sabrina Guevara, and she went on to do a variety of different things too, also in the kind of genre of spec fic and science fiction. She was in the most recent X-Men film. She was in Gotham, and she's had some roles in Handmaid's Tale.
Oh,
And it was a small role in X-Men. It was, I think it's credited on IMDb as something task secretary or something or other. So,
oh, okay.
but not a big role, but she's gone on to do some things. So some folks who have gone on to do some really things. And this is a really sort of poignant episode, right? It begins, it's Christmas time in New York City sometime in the future, and it's just a few days before Christmas, but it's 120 degrees in New York City,
hmm
right? And so the story begins with that setting. So Robyn, can you tell us a little bit about what this episode is about?
Yeah, so like you said, the episode opens up, right? It's 5 days before Christmas, New York City. You can tell it's incredibly hot outside, but there's also a radio broadcast happening, and it tells you it's 1:20 outside, right? And we have our main character, Bato, and he's riding his bike along. And you can tell he's a very well-liked member of the community, seems to be somewhat of a leader within this community. He is on his way to what seems like maybe a youth organization place, and which it seems like he runs. But in the background, you start seeing ads or different flyers. One of them says "Not One Drop" and has the the solidarity fist on it. Another one says, "Turn color into cash," and you're sort of starting to wonder, like, what is happening in this time and place, right? So, and then a conversation happens between Bato and one of the children at the youth center, and she tells him, she doesn't go into detail, she just says, "You know what we talked about? My dad did that." And he, comforts this child, and he says, "Oh, he's a blackout." And you're sort of left wondering, okay, what is happening? What's a blackout? What drops are we talking about? And then Bato is summoned home, right? An emergency is happening with his wife, Gina. Turns out she's very pregnant, and she is going into labor. Now, they had plans to have this baby at home, but because she's going into labor sooner than they thought, they need to go to the clinic, but they don't have money to go to the clinic. So Bato says, "Okay, well, I'm gonna find the money." So he goes back to the center, he goes to his office, he's rummaging around, he finds some cash. He also finds a gun, which he reluctantly takes, and he goes back out into this world. Now, the sun is so intense in this world that they actually have a curfew around what seems to be noontime, or the hottest parts of the day. So he's out during this curfew. He sees somebody he doesn't quite recognize, but they've got a nice watch and a nice ring on. So he goes up to them to actually rob them. It seems like a white person, right? And when this person turns around, he recognizes that it's his friend from the center who's been playing Black Santa for him, right? And he is shocked because this person, who earlier in the film we saw was a black man, is now a white man, or appears to be a white man. And this is when you start to realize, oh, this is what they mean, turn color into cash. So he's shocked by this. He doesn't rob him. He instead goes to this place where they presumably medically extract the melanin from his skin to give it to someone else so that they can survive the sun better. And they pay him for this service, though we don't know how much he gets paid, but I mean, we're left to sort of assume, because all these people, I mean, this seems to be a very poor community. They're still in poverty. We're left to assume that it's not very much. And then at the very end of the film, you see Gina, she gives birth, right? And the midwife says, "Bato, catch the baby, come catch the baby," right? And all you see are like these white arms, white-skinned arms outreaching, and a black child is put into them. That's the synopsis of the film. It's terrifying.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so literally, right, the story is that they are extracting the melanin from darker skinned people so that richer Americans can use it to protect themselves from the UV radiation that is now pummeling, right, the earth because of, right, global warming and all these kinds of things. So there's a market been created for melanin, right? And it's sort of like folks who, I guess, right? Cell plasma. It's sort of portrayed as right in the way in which blood or plasma is sold. It's like this thing that you can do, but you know, like you were saying, Robert, it doesn't seem as though people make a lot of money from it. But it leaves you not desanguinated, I guess. I don't know, demelanized,
Right.
I guess. And so part of this kind of question is, I mean, the allegory is really quite strong, right? The question about like the erasure of Black lives, the erasure of Black culture, the kinds of ways in which white folk appropriate Black culture. And here it, you know, it's literally their Blackness now has become something that white people can take away from Black folk, right? So the
Right.
political allegory is really really rich to talk about. But I just wanted to sort of note some things. I was looking into some research about melanin, and what I like about this episode in one way is it's sort of like I sometimes call FutureStates the PBS version of Black Mirror. That
Right.
a lot of the a lot of the episodes in FutureStates focus on technological developments and what those could possibly be in the way that Black Mirror does. Though Black Mirror tends to focus much more on the kind of dystopian elements of technology. And here you're sort of seeing a dystopia that's based on possible kinds of scientific developments, but it's much more sort of allegorical about social justice issues.
Mm.
Right. And so but looking into the science of this, I was really quite shocked, right, to sort of think about this, like right now in the world, um, right, extracting melanin for other people's use is not possible. Um, but in some sense, it's quite the opposite. Like, so in 2014, almost 30% of global skincare products were made to slow down melatonin formation, right?
Mhm.
What's called melogenesis, right? So there's a huge market, particularly in Asia, for skin whitening
Mhm.
products.
Yeah.
And so this is like almost a third of all global skincare products have to do with trying to control melanin development, right? So melanin is one of these things that people spend a lot of time worrying about, trying to develop, and at least in, you know, as we see with these kinds of figures about Asia, people are really concerned about developing too much melanin,
Mhm.
right, in order to appear whiter than they normally would be. But there's been a lot of research in melanin that suggests that it's actually a valuable product, right? So in 2017, there was some research done with melanin derived from fungi. So melanin is something that's found not just in human beings, but in a whole variety of different kinds of species. And there's certain kinds of black fungi, right, that have high melanin content. And so what they've been trying to figure out is whether or not melanin might be able to be used to coat space materials to protect it from cosmic radiation. So they were growing
Interesting.
mushrooms on the ISS to try to see whether or not um, how it performed against cosmic radiation, because in the future it might be something that could be used as a coating for biological materials in space,
Mhm.
including perhaps human beings, right? So various kinds of synthetic melanin might be able to be created to help us in long-term space exploration to keep us safe from cosmic radiation, because I mean, that's what its function is with UV radiation.
Right.
Um, but some interesting, there was an article in Popular Science last year that raised some new uses for melanin. So, you know, it's mostly something that protects us against UV radiation, but people have now found, researchers have now found that melanin actually conducts electricity. So there's some research that has been done. People have known this for a while, but now there's been some research that has been able to increase how much electricity melanin conduces. And so the idea could be that they could use melanin as a coating on different kinds of devices that you would be implanted into your body, and your body then could generate electricity that would be conduced by these melanin coated objects or devices in your body to power things, right? So, right, our headphones in the future could be powered by our body movement, our body's actions in various ways, because the melanin coated devices would be, you know, using our own biological melanin, right, would be powering devices, you know, our headphones, our cell phones, as different kinds of things like this.
Or even
So,
something that's implanted in the body, like a pacemaker.
a pacemaker, yeah, there could be sort of all sort of different kinds of medical uses for this melanin used as this kind of electrical conduit. So there's, it's one of these things that you start to realize that it has all these kinds of different possibilities. It could be something that would be very valuable um, in uh, in the future. There could be a market for melanin, right? And so the idea of a world in which the sun has become so overpowering that people need more melanin is actually not that far off.
Mm.
Uh, and so, and you know, it's possible to create these kinds of synthetic, or to use things like black fungi to create various kinds of melanin. But right, the political allegory of this is really interesting, and the science is actually not that far off, right? Or at least within the realm of possibility. But right, the political allegory of, right, taking away the blackness of black people is a really sort of heavy kind of aspect of this episode.
Yeah, I remember when we first watched it. It's actually scary. It's scarier now that you put out the sort of scientific uses for melanin, because in some way, I remember when we first watched it in your class, I thought I could see this happening, but you find a little bit of comfort and safety in the idea of like, okay, but could we really extract all of the melanin out of somebody, and could you really implant it in somebody else and use it in any kind of real way? Um, you know, and we imagine that that answer is no, but now that that answer is yes, it's sort of more like, holy shit, right? Because in some ways it is, when you first watch it, it's sort of, it is that allegory, right? This idea that racism and white supremacy takes many forms over time. It's interesting that you bring up Asia, because in the United States, or we tend to think of white supremacy as being like a United States thing.
Mm.
Um, but white supremacy is found throughout the world. It maybe just not in the same form that it takes here in the United States, right? The idea that white skin or lighter skin is more beautiful, more advantageous, more whatever. In Asia, that's another form of white supremacy. So,
Right.
and
No,
you
that's
find
right.
it even in Mexico, this
Yeah.
sort of lighter skinned, and bleaching, skin bleaching has been around for a really long time.
No, I mean, I think it's it makes me think about W.E.B. Du Bois and his Souls of White Folk, right, essay, where he talks about, you know, you have to realize that white supremacy is a global phenomenon. It's not an accident in the United States. It drives so much of global politics, right? And in that essay, he talks about, you know, in order to understand so much about the world and foreign policy and the ways in which nations work, most of it is pursuing white dominance over darker races. And so, I mean, that sort of explains, I think, what's going on with, you know, the skincare industry, is that so many, probably billions of dollars of research. I didn't look into this to see, but, you know, 30% of global skincare products are about inhibiting melogenesis. That's got to be billions of dollars devoted to skin whitening, right? And
Right.
so there's a premium on white skin that, right, what White suggests, the episode White suggests, is that in the future it may be black skin that is advantageous, but not necessarily a premium, right? Because that's the interesting thing about, like, the episode, is that people want the melanin, but they don't pay very much for it, right?
Right.
And black folk will sell it out of desperation, right? And so in talking about this with you made me think a lot about the critical race theorist Derek Bell and his idea of the
Mm,
permanence of racism, right?
right.
That if you think about the United States, right, one of the sort of main pillars of this theory, right, is that racism is a permanent feature of the political, economic, social, cultural life of the United States, and it will always be that way unless there's some sort of massive kind of social upheaval and this civilization, this country is totally upended and drawn up on different kinds of ways. But there's no sort of getting away from racism in various kinds of forms. And as you were sort of just saying, right, it just will take different kinds of roots and different kinds of forms. So I was thinking about, like, thinking about the ways in which, right, Black folk in the United States have been used in these kinds of ways, right? From initially the very sort of beginning parts of the labor exploitation under slavery,
Mm-hmm.
right? Going hand in hand with kind of settler colonialism and land appropriation of native peoples. So, you have literal people's bodies being, control of their bodies being taken away from them. You have people's lands being taken away from them. And then you just have sort of general kind of cultural appropriation where cultural products are taken away from people for the use and profit of, right, the mainstream, or
Right.
right. And you can think about this in terms of like the ways in which people have talked about how Black cultural forms, music, art, things like that get sort of taken away and developed in a different kind of way. So it's like, just the development of blues, rock and roll,
Mm-hmm.
R&B, right, all hip hop, all this kind of stuff became that was sort of had its origins in Black culture, sort of then start to become something that is appropriated and made profit making for other people. So sort of like, blood sucking, right? you
Yeah.
you, you are taking away. And so, right, there's all this allegory in White about, like, even Black folks' Blackness eventually will be taken away from them for the use of white folks, and they won't necessarily credit Black folk very much for using it, right? And
Right.
so the episode right at the end of it, right, as you were sort of pointing out, it is really depressing because you realize, Bato has given up, right, something that he was really proud of at the beginning, right, because he was running this sort of like Black cultural center. And
Mm,
so in order for his child to live, he had to give up this thing that might have been what was really defining him as a person.
right. And he points this out in the beginning of the film, right? When he's comforting that child, when he's trying to say, okay, your dad is a blackout now, but everything's going to be fine, and don't forget he left your inheritance right here, and he points to her skin. He says your dad's inheritance that he left you is right here. It's always with you. Um, and that stuck with me, and it's has sort of niggled in the back of my brain this idea of that inheritance. As a white person, I don't quite understand that, right? Because one of the features of whiteness is a sort of erasure of cultural background, right? um, but I've been thinking about this, and this has stuck with me, this idea that inheritance is more than, right, what we're physically given. I mean, material wise, it's also sort of this passed down through our genetics inheritance, passed down in this sort of transferred way of our culture.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, it's sort of,
it's
the kinds of ways in which we're starting to think about and realize how trauma is generational, right? That it leaves actual physical marks in the body that predispose, further like if you suffer traumatic stress and injury and pain, that this changes you on a genetic level, and
Mhm.
that predisposes future generations to have various kinds of conditions because of that trauma, right?
Right,
So the traumas of slavery are not gone away just because we've gotten rid of slavery and segregation and stuff like that. Like, it has health effects,
right,
right? And so the sort of emphasis on the biological is not just something that's allegorical. It's real in that sense, in the inheritance of the body. And so, what does it mean to be in a world in which, right, the melanin can be taken away from you, and the ways in which having black skin has come to define people's identity and culture and the ways in which people get treated? What would it mean to be in a world in which that kind of stuff can be extracted from people in a procedure that is very cheap and inexpensive, and for the benefit, again, of white people?
Right. And particularly when your identity is so wrapped up in something uh, and something so visible, right? As a white person, I don't understand what it is to walk through the world and think about my race, right? Because white is the default. So I never have to think about what do people think about me being white, right? But in some ways, I can understand this because woman is not the default, and I
Mm.
identify as a woman. So I sort of get that, but I can't even imagine what it must be to have that piece of your identity extracted from you, and not in a willing way. I mean, sure, Bato made this choice, but it's not a choice he made willingly.
Right.
It's not, you know, I mean, he's certainly being exploited. The poor are being exploited in this way.
Right.
So I don't know that we can call those free choices, so to
Right.
speak.
Right. He does it out of desperation because he needs money for his wife's delivery.
Right.
Right.
Uh,
The other thing that made me, that I thought about when I was thinking about this episode, and some stuff that you said to me beforehand as we were thinking about this episode, made me think about the case of Henrietta Lacks.
right. Mm-hmm.
Right. This came up to me, right? And so for listeners, if you don't know the case of Henrietta Lacks, there's a famous book, right, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, made into a feature film, I think back in 2017 by Oprah.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen this, and I don't know, but the case is really famous, right? Henrietta Lacks was this African-American woman who in 1951 had some cancerous cells harvested from her cervix, unbeknownst to her by her doctors, and something that eventually killed her because the cancer metastasized through her whole body. But these cells were harvested without her consent and without her knowledge. And then they were used in medical research, and they're still being used in medical research, by the way. Part of it is that researchers found that her cells were really unique in the sense that they multiplied very easily and very quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and so they had longevity, and so they essentially kept growing her cell line. And so there's actually a cell line called the Healy cell line, based at Gila, after Henrietta Lacks, right? Her cells are still alive. She died in 1951, but her cells are still alive. And in fact, researchers have been harvesting her cells ever since then. And this sort of jumped out at me the other day, that um, currently 50 million metric tons of her biological matter have been harvested since
No.
1951. Right, people have taken this part of her body and have just started to use it because it has these unique properties of being, it multiplies very quickly and has this long life. And so this is why,
Yeah.
right, this is why we talk about the immortal lives of Henrietta Lacks, is because literally a part of her is immortal, right?
Mm-hmm.
These cancerous cells from her cervix. But what's interesting is that her cells have been so important for a lot of different medical research. In fact, Jonas Salk apparently used cells from the Gila cell culture to develop the polio vaccine. They've gone on to medical research in AIDS research, and they are also used in skincare testing.
Oh, man.
Right, and so what's interesting about this is that this biological matter was taken from her without her consent, without her knowledge, really, and her family didn't know about this until many years later, that this was taking place. But so much sort of medical science has come as a result of being able to extract this matter from an African American body.
Mhm.
Right. And so this adds another sort of level to the kind of reality of this episode, is that, do we live in a world where it would be the case that we would literally harvest the biological matter of Black bodies for the benefit of white people? Yeah, we
Yeah.
have.
Hmm.
Right. And the science is there that melanin might possibly be something that could be particularly valuable for us. So white is not out of the realm of possibility, either politically, ethically, or scientifically.
Right.
And that's
I
what
mean,
makes this episode so chilling, I think.
yeah, I agree. And it's even if you think about it in terms of organs, it's not, we may take for granted, it's not illegal everywhere to sell your organs,
Yeah.
right? There are plenty of places in the world where people are being exploited today. Poor people are being exploited today for their kidneys,
Yeah.
selling off their kidneys so that largely rich white people can benefit because, at least here in the United States, we have a lottery where, we're trying to do things fairly. But, and that's what I worry about is, I mean, this is the ultimate exploitation of a Black or brown body. We've gone from slavery, right, to mass incarceration, where we still exploit those bodies for labor. I was just reading today about Louisiana and how it's now like a privilege for Louisiana inmates to work at the Louisiana state legislature or in the governor's house, which looks amazingly like a plantation house. Um, so now here we are here. So it's not a stretch of the imagination to imagine at some point we'll be like, yeah, give us your Blackness too.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
mean, I was just reading an article that was talking about, again, going back to Black Mirror, and talking about, like, Black Mirror talks about, like, what technology might look like in the next few years. But what's interesting about that show, and I think that it's true about this episode too, is that these shows are not necessarily about how science or technology will change us. Right. It's really more about how science and technology just lets us show
Continue.
more how unethical we already are, or gives us
Right.
more opportunities to be unethical.
Yeah.
And right, I think that what White really highlights is that the ability to extract melanin for protection from UV radiation because of global warming in the future is a scientific possibility, not just because the science could go there, but also because the tendencies of our society have been to exploit and excavate resources from marginalized communities for the benefit of others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Capitalism does this, white supremacy does this. And so this episode is really this kind of question about the permanence of racism, is that this country is built in such a way so that we will always find ways to exploit marginalized communities for the benefit of white mainstream culture, and it will just be in new formations, in new situations, new environments, under different terms. And this is just one possible sort of scenario.
Yeah. Um, I mean, even in, and we were sort of talking about this, even in radical movements, even in, movements for justice, you see this sort of cultural appropriation, or you see this sort of appropriation happening by white folk against people of color, even within that fight for racial justice. So it's not a hard jump there. And I think as white folk, what we have to be particularly cautious about, what we have to be constantly questioning ourselves with, is what iteration are we in now? Is my own internalized white supremacy just taking on a new form?
Oh, that's
Sure,
interesting.
sure, I'm not, using racial slurs and I'm not doing this, but did I just vote for this law that's going to disproportionately affect, Black folk? Did I just go to that protest and center myself within that protest, right? So we have to be more careful about uh, the various ways in which our own racisms are going to manifest themselves, right? And that's what
Yeah.
I worry about is like, the civil rights movement happened and all of white America sort of went, yay, racism's over, without understanding that that is in each of us, right? We have our own inheritance, and that inheritance has been racism. And and we haven't done any work to sort of root that out. And
That's
that's what I
interesting.
think allows this all to keep going.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking a little bit before about stuff that's going on with um, the the Black Lives Matter protests here in Portland, Oregon, in the past month or so. We were talking about this just previously before we started recording, right? The politics that have gotten really complicated here because there's been this worry that the protests against the presence of federal officers at the Federal Justice Center has become more about the presence of these officers as opposed to the protection of, and forefronting the Black Lives Matter protests.
Mm.
And this is even broken down to the sort of the politics of allyship, right? Because the big thing, of course, that happened in the past couple of weeks in Portland was there was this group that rose up a few weeks ago that was a group of moms. Um, and This was mostly at the beginning, I think, a group of white sort of moms who came out and were forming walls of protection for the protesters. And I guess there was some questions about like the makeup of this. And so some African American women became part of the wall of moms. And it seems as though this organization has really had some difficult conversations because one of the women, a white woman, sort of broke off and started registering the name of Wall of Moms as a nonprofit organization with the state of Oregon.
Mm.
So essentially running with the name in such a way that would enable her to be able to um, make money, right, off of the organization. And this has created lots of different kinds of political denunciation and back and forth in circles of Portland about this particular tactic in the first place, but also just like, here's another example of a white woman or another white person sort of forefronting themselves and trying to use a situation to make money. So
Mm.
exploiting the situation, the protest situation for their own benefit. This also has to do with like this question of like the the Athena ballerina, the woman who decided to uh, go naked right during
Naked
the
Athena.
yeah, naked Athena, right? And there was a lot of discussion where people were like, a lot of activists of color in Portland were like, this is really distracting from the message of Black Lives Matter and the purpose of this protest. And here's another white woman centering herself and her nakedness. And then people are coming back and saying, well, she's actually not white; she's a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so but she's not black, right? I think it turned out that she, if I'm not mistaken, I believe she's Asian.
Mm.
But she's not like not typically right white. She's a person of
Right.
color. But it sort of created this kind of question: is like, what are the kinds of things that can be done in social movements that keep the voices and the perspectives of BIPOC communities, but particularly Black communities, forefronted, and what can white people do to be allies in a way that doesn't get all the attention on them? And
Mm-hmm.
so we've seen this going on, right? And so it's sort of following up on your point is that white really sort of raises the question, like, if the permanence of racism is really true, you have to expect that at some point or another, white people are going to try to take advantage of situations, even including movements for social justice, in order for their own benefits. And that's just something that we have to come to terms with, to understand, and to deal with when thinking about movement forwards. That's really a frustrating message to swallow. But if that's what the critical race theory really says, is, I mean, we should just expect that this is going to happen, and we have to sort of learn to deal with it and maybe learn to mitigate it. But
Right.
that white supremacy is this kind of thing that it's always going to be looking for ways to take advantage of situations.
Right. And that doesn't even have to be within the movement itself. Like, it's not necessarily, well, I don't want to make a comment about this actually. It could be the wall of moms, right? I don't know them personally. I haven't, so I don't want to make like, ooh, they're trying to center themselves. They're trying to do this or whatever.
Yeah, it's a
But
complicated situation. I don't
yeah,
know the whole details either.
so I want to be clear. I'm not making some sort of statement on what I think the walls of moms is. I'm just using them as an example, or even Naked Athena, right? It doesn't even have to be them, because perhaps Naked Athena, that's not their intention at all, right? But it could be white supremacy, and that, and a particular iteration of white supremacy happening within the press, right? Oh, well, I'm going to center this story because it's, you know, it's a bunch of white moms or whatever, or it's a perhaps maybe white appearing. I actually have never seen her front, so I've only seen Naked Athena's back,
Yeah.
but white appearing person. So it doesn't necessarily even have to be those people themselves. It could just even be white supremacy playing out in the press, in that we give voices in the way we're amplifying particular voices, right? And those voices are white.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that that's right. I think it's hard, I think, because, I think some of the folks who were involved with Wall of Moms were saying, like, it wasn't our intention to do this. We
Mm-hmm.
didn't mean to sort of take attention away. We sort of wanted to come there to, sort of put our bodies on the line to protect people. But the press sort of, as you were saying, kind of like sometimes can focus on a certain kind of thing and make it the story.
Mm-hmm.
And that can then frustrate BIPOC activists, right? Who are saying like, "Hey, you moved the focus."
Mm-hmm.
But I think what White suggests, and what Derek Bell, who is doing this, is that is you just got to come to realize that that's always going to be the way that things going to work.
Right.
And we don't have to go into more of his theories here, but it if you buy this kind of story about this account of white supremacy, it really these kinds of ways of centering white voices and continuing exploitation of marginalized communities is always going to happen. And don't get disturbed, just realize that it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But then that leads to that kind of pessimistic sort of view that it's permanent, about the permanence of racism, is that you should expect it always to happen, and it will always happen. Black people will always be marginalized and exploited in these kinds of ways. It will just be a different reiteration, as you were suggesting. And so
Yeah.
I think that this is something hard for maybe white folk to think about, right? Because as you were saying, then the question is, if you sort of are trying to be a woke white person, is like, you always have to ask yourself, like, um, am I just engaging in the new iteration of
Mm-hmm.
this process? But I think also for like BIPOC activists, I think that part of what Derek Bell's work is too is sort of meant to be a wake-up call. Is like, don't be naive and think that things can change through
Right.
your activism within the structure.
Right. Yeah. I just, it is sort of depressing, right, when we talk about Derek Bell, because obviously we all want to have hope. We all want to have that Martin Luther King moment, the audacity of that sort of hopeful message. We all want that, but I think one of the things that Derek Bell, at least what the way he speaks to me, is saying like, Robyn, you can't let hope like make you complacent. For me as a white person, like, it's exhausting, but there's some sense in which every day you have to be constantly engaged. And it goes back to, or it goes to Kendi, right? This idea that
Mm.
to be an anti-racist is an active thing. It's you have to be constantly active in it. You can't just be like, I voted for Barack Obama. I'm not racist. You know,
Right.
check. I went to my Floyd protest. I'm not racist. So there's sort of two messages, right? One to people of color, like, don't sit on your haunches and believe that like this stuff is ever going to end. And then there's the message to white folk, which is like, hey, this is your mess to clean up, and you have to be constantly questioning, constantly engaged in the work, because if you're not, the moment that you're not, you're part of that new iteration.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about like bringing Ibrahim Kendi's work into this in that way, right? Is that uh, as a sub? I mean, I don't know if he would necessarily think of himself in the sort of Derek Bell tradition, but it does raise this kind of question, right? That uh, um, you always, if white supremacy functions in this kind of way, then you have to sort of always be on guard to engage in anti-racist work.
Mm-hmm.
Because white supremacy always finds a way to take advantage of marginalized communities of color.
Right. And, you know, I know that Bell is really saying, you know, the United States that we know is always going to have these racist systems because it was built that way, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
foundation is
yeah,
racist.
yeah, yeah,
So until we tear down the foundation, we are not going to get a system that is racially just.
right.
But I like to think about that even further. You know, it's not just that, because if we don't do the work within ourselves on a personal, person to person level, we will just reinfuse whatever new system is there with another iteration of racism. So it's not just tearing down of the structures. That has to happen. We have to change all of that, but we also need to change us.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the hard work, right? Like King used to say, Martin Luther King, when he was talking about, you know, the kind of work that needed to be done. We've talked about this before too, right? It's at different levels, right? On the one hand, he says, look, we need laws because it's important to have laws that will prohibit someone from lynching me,
Mm-hmm.
right? But at the same time, I realize that a law is not going to touch a person's heart and to make them not hate me. And so that's added work, right? That's sort of changing people's minds. But both of them are important. He says we both need the laws that keep people from doing harm to one another for the you know, to enact racist violence. But we also need that sort of cultural work too, to be able to try to figure out like how to deal with the kind of structures of racism in our mentalities.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those are necessary at the same time. And I think that part of what you're suggesting, right, is that for a lot of times, and maybe this is sort of like a legacy of the civil rights movement, is that the belief that, you know, if you just have some laws, or if you just have the right politicians in place, that's what you need to really sort of confront the issues. But that policy and laws and maybe the good politicians, that's just a necessary condition of a much larger sort of picture of work that needs to be done, that includes this kind of cultural work of trying to undermine um, interpersonal racism.
Mm-hmm.
So, you
Right.
know, I think that this is all the kind of stuff that Derek Bell sort of realizes, and why he comes up with this kind of conclusion of the permanence of racism is just that this is just too
It's
much.
too much.
It's just too much work. Not that, you know, we should give up hope and say, you know, look, it's just that we can't do it, but it's just like, if that's really what the goal is, to create a non-white supremacist United States, you're not going to be able to fix it within the structures of things the way they are. You're really going to have to change the whole sort of thing up, and most people aren't really up for that task.
Right. Um, I think you posted an article today about if the election happened today, 50% of white people would vote for President Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and on the one hand, it's sort of like, oh man, that sucks, you know? But on the other hand, I feel sort of hopeful about that. That means 50% of white people wouldn't do that. That means we're getting through to some of them, right? So, you know, and I I don't want to be that person that King talks about. Oh, it's just going to take time. I wish we could speed this up, but the fact of the matter is people have to want to change. You know, I find a lot of hope in the coming generations because I think they are seeing these things. I think they are more visible and they are more in tune and they are thinking about racial justice a lot more than I certainly ever did when I was growing up, and I'm not really that old. So,
Yeah, yeah. So this is a question about these generational politics, which is always really complicated. I had a student in one of my classes once taught when we were talking about these kind of questions about social change, and she grew up in Poland, and she told me that there's a saying in Poland, which is something like the effect of it is that sometimes you just got to let the bastards die. And I was like, wow, that's one a kind of a wise thing, and then the other thing is like, wow, that's dark.
I
But
mean, my daughter says something similar. She always goes, "Well, I guess it's just going to be up to us." It's like, I'm sorry, honey.
yeah. No, I mean, there maybe there's something to that, but I think that that sort of speaks again to this kind of question about like um, what are the kinds of politics moving forward that maybe young people want to enact? And there is some kind of evidence to suggest that, you know, Generation Z or whatever, people who are between the ages of 18 to 25 right now are willing to consider doing things that other generations would certainly not boomers, right? So questions about
Right.
like, you know, like questions about whether or not capitalism is a system that they want to support, questions about like, you know, do they want,
Democracy.
yeah, democracy, socialized medicine, abolishing ICE and Homeland Security and stuff like this. Yeah, you know, Generation Z are willing to do, at least in attitude polls, right, are sort of willing to entertain lots of really big institutional reforms that older generations just wouldn't even touch. And so maybe that's the case. Maybe there is hope that way, that, you know, that kind of foundational change that Derek Bell was talking about is possible for a future generation.
Yeah.
But um, you know, it's certainly not going to be the case that this change will happen. I think King and I think that Bell probably and Kendi are probably all agreement about this, is that it's not going to change by voting in the right candidate or having that the right sort of special law. But those things can help, but it's not going to do the work.
Right. And largely, you know, that work is going to be left up to white people, unfortunately. Right. Um,
Yeah.
so when I say, I do want to be clear when I say, like, I find hope in future generations, I'm not saying that I'm just leaving it up to them.
Yeah.
Like, uh, the fact that I think, yeah, it's probably not going to change for several generations to come, I don't think that lets any of us off the hook, you know, with the work. We all have to do the work because if I'm not having those conversations with my kids, then what hope do I have of them doing the work, right? So
Yeah.
it's a lot of
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, it is a lot of work. No, this is I think that this is what's interesting about these kinds of episodes, like particularly this episode of Future States, right, is that um, they sort of give us an insight into what can happen if we, right, don't get our shit together,
Hmm.
or right, if we sort of let certain past historical practices move ahead, it could be um, it could result in some things that seem shocking, but when you put them in the context of history, they're not so shocking. I mean, I think this is like what's really good about, for instance, again, another sort of Afrofuturist work by Derek Bell, right?
Hmm.
The space traders, right?
Oh,
I like thinking about white in the same sort of tradition as the space traders. Is just that, you know, you watch this kind of thing, this kind of science fiction story, and you think, oh my God, that's just crazy. But if right, for those who haven't seen or read the Space Traders, right, it's Derek Bell writes this story about like what happens if aliens come to the United States and they say, you know, we'll solve all your economic, social problems if you give us everyone who contains a certain kind of quantity of melanin in their skin. So
Mhm.
essentially all black people. So if you give us all black people, we will solve all your problems. And so the question is, would the United States be willing to make that trade?
Of course they would.
Right. And that's, at the end of it all is like, of course, but initially it's like, oh, that's crazy. Like no one would do that. We wouldn't give away. And the way the story proceeds, Derek Bell, at least in the short story, right, he sort of shows like, well, historically white people have done this has happened here, this, Japanese internment, slavery, settler colonialism, all these kinds of things. And we've done all of these things in some way or another already historically. Why wouldn't we do this?
Yep.
Right. And so white is really interesting in that regard, is like, look, we've taken black music, we've taken black culture, we've done this, we've taken black lives, right? Why wouldn't we take even their blackness?
Right.
We're sort of left there, right? Like, what are black folks left with at the end of the day if their blackness itself can be taken away from them? And and the story sort of leaves you thinking, wow, that could happen.
It could. It could. And it's important that we, start asking these questions now before we develop that technology to give us the choice. you know?
Always. Yeah. Yeah. That's the power, I think, of all these kinds of stories. But
Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you, Robyn, for helping me get a different appreciation of this thing that I've liked for a long time. But thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you to all the listeners and everyone tuning in. You are either watching us on our video cast here. If you are watching our video cast, you can check out some of our other videos and other episodes of Future States Focus that we've taken a look at, or some of the other work that the Anarres Project does. And so take a look at some of our videos or subscribe to our YouTube channel. The Future States Focus videocasts are also available on podcasts on SoundCloud, so you can check those out. And this one will be available as an audio podcast for those of you who like to listen rather than to watch our lovely faces. So until next time, Robyn, thanks very much, and I look forward to our next discussions on Future States Focus. So thanks a lot.
I'll see you next time.
See you next time.